I actually remembered after seeing the show that I had seen Xiao Jiang's work in several group shows in China before the pandemic. But what's interesting about his work is that his peers and artists younger than him were making loud works, fast works, works that captured the speed of growth of China during that time period. And then when I walked into China, it was like, oh, yes, I remember this work, but it's so slow and so soothing and so calming that it's hard to believe that the artist grew up in the same country or the same time period as some of his peers. Tonight, we're all going to talk about our connection to Xiao Jiang and a little bit about his history and a lot about his paintings, which are truly beautiful in person. And I urge you to come see the show if you can. So I'd like to start with just asking both Winnie and Maja, what do you feel is your connection to this work? And what interests you about this work?
I'm so glad to be speaking to both of you, and I want to thank Karma for inviting me to talk about Xiao's work. I think I would have a hard time talking about just any painter's work in general or any artist, but when they asked me to speak about Xiao's work, I was like, oh yeah, I can definitely do this. And I think the reason why my response was so immediate was this slowness you talked about, Barbara. Even though I haven't seen the work in person, I actually have a studio manager who lives in New York, and he was able to give me the full report and send me a lot of close-ups. And but I find this work really profound and, dare I say, radical for the moment that we're living in. I find, especially living in America, that there's so much importance placed on work to be responsible. There's almost like this responsibility that the artist has to almost educate the audience or propose to us what's happening in the world in a really politically charged way. And this work does something, I think, much more meaningful and important to me on a very deep emotional level. And that is, it allows me to take a breath, to slow down, and to really contemplate the simplicity of the images he's providing for us. So I'd say those are the two main things that really draw me in, is this sense where he's not trying to be, quote, responsible in terms of touching on very heated, kind of inflammatory, quote, issues, work that I feel plagues the American art landscape. So I find it really refreshing to be looking at images like this that are the opposite of Instagram quality snapshots, that even though I'm not seeing these works in person, they slow me down. And I think I mentioned before I did this, I was paying bills and dealing with a lot of domestic kind of boring issues, and just going through the PDF was almost like a palate cleanser. Like I could feel my brain really slowing down. So I'd say that's it for me.
And Winnie?
I really like what you're saying about how you connect to the slowness of it as a kind of departure from the kind of presentism of immediate political issues or social issues here in America. For me, that slowness works in another way, which is that this work has a way of speaking to the longer history to me of Chinese life across the 20th century, in the way that it's both quite recognizable in a contemporary sense, but on the other hand, sort of stripped of all the kind of growth and immediacy, that speed that Barbara was talking about, to the extent that it almost seems nostalgic. It almost seems to recall a time when modernism was new, when modernism was just envisioning a future that didn't yet involve all this consumerism. I mean, you really do feel like this sort of the industrial man-made sort of effect on mountains here, for example, like this sort of the power of modernity, and you feel these hallmarks of the isolation and the private lives that we lead in modernity, and yet it speaks to just this longer period of experiencing this in China since like the 1900s, despite the massive changes that have happened in China. And so there's both this specific timelessness that's enabled by the slowness that I think you also sense.
It's interesting that he grew up in Jiangxi province, which has mountainous areas like this and beautiful landscape. And also it is a center of practicing traditional crafts in China, like porcelain. And even though he lives outside of Shanghai now, he says he paints these pictures as from memories, sometimes from photographs, but really heavily from memories. And that sense of nostalgia you're talking about is redolent in the work.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that sense of nostalgia, Winnie. I definitely felt that. And when we spoke to him the other day, I asked him about the sense of melancholy, this sort of somber mood. And I loved that it wasn't something that he starts out with. It's not like an intention to create a melancholy painting, but this sense of like his figures, there's a great sense of solitude and privacy. And I somehow feel that is in the lack of specificity. It's almost like he gives room for the breath that we bring into the work, or that's evoked in us, is actually because these figures are faceless. The gender is even ambiguous. The sense of space is not totally clear. So there's almost like a dream logic, even though they're not surrealist in any way. I feel that they awaken a mood in me that I feel like some surrealist work does. So it's really interesting how he's like using a very different formal language to activate certain psychological states that I find really kind of uncanny and a little, almost a little haunting in a way, but not in a big way. Like,
yeah, as a art historian, I'm really interested in how he manages to achieve this. Everything that he's said to us the other day didn't really give many clues to that. But I've met many painters with a similar training as Xiao Jiang in a very highly technical university setting, like what we call a normal university or teacher's college in China, where the skills training is extremely high level, but is not part of the elite Chinese academic system with its really sort of complex and heavy legacies. And at the same time, artists like him, I've been learning, have to figure out how they relate to these academies, how they relate to this very institutionalized form of artistic expression. And they have to deal with gaining legitimacy through the market, through the art market, as an independent, as a private painter, which is something maybe we're more familiar with, but kind of being caught between those two very powerful regimes, I guess, the market and the academy, is very difficult. And very, very few artists, I think, are able to retain such a kind of stable and timeless kind of oeuvre, right, through such a long period as Xiao Jiang has been working in this way. And it makes me wonder how much of this work is really very much a process, like the process of painting as a way of making sense of that conundrum that an independent painter is in at any given moment. He spoke to us about, how long it takes them to do a painting and how indeterminate the process is, but ultimately how everything that is there needs to be there. His sort of confidence that it is a resolution, it is a solved problem as a composition was very, I think, telling to me that it is about working out a problem in daily existence as an artist.
I just wanted to point out, before you go, Maya, that these paintings are painted on burlap, not linen. And so the whole process of making them is very time consuming because it's not a surface on which you can easily apply paint. And so there's a meditative quality to his process. But also, you talked about that he did not go through official art training and in one of the major art schools, but that may have saved him because the training in those schools is very often an emphasis on hyper-realist painting. Mm-hmm. And then I've seen a number of artists have to reteach themselves how to paint after that training, whereas he had a certain freedom in his imagination and in his choice of materials and those things. Maya, I'm sorry.
No, I think that's really great what you mentioned there. I just wanted to kind of add on to what Winnie was saying about that there's a real sense of him trying to solve a problem. And actually, that's the part that I think is really radical about his paintings. He's not shy to let us know that he's trying to make a good composition with titles such as Composition or In the Studio. Again, he's unapologetic about the drive and the difficulty of making a good painting, and that impulse is enough. Something that, as someone who was educated in the US, I studied in Berkeley and then I went to CCA, where the emphasis is so heavily on responsibility and intention. What message are you trying to tell us through the painting? Almost to the point where the painting is just the propaganda and the message is the main driving force. And I actually feel that Xiao is, he's saying the painting is the message, the painting itself. And of course, I, as a painter who paints in a similar vein, I find that so inspiring and really fruitful. And I also wanted to say something about the texture of his work, which is there's a sense that he's working really hard to apply the pigment on the surface. And he mentioned how he did a bunch of experiments on different surfaces, like he's painted on canvas and linen, but he actually likes the inefficiency of burlap. And I think that's really important, that kind of the stumbling across or working really hard to get whatever he can down, that sense of urgency is interesting when it's embedded in this like really slow composition. So they're actually like two forces working. Like if you look really close, you see how hard he's pressing the pigment in, yet the image itself seems so effortless and opens up the viewing space. And I think that's just so interesting and really kind of genius to braid those two opposites together to create this really interesting image.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of scraping and revision on them, but you don't feel the brushwork of that. Like you don't feel the touch of that, but you can tell it was there, that the editing process was really long.
Right. And I almost feel like that's the thing that I find kind of uncanny, and this, it evokes this very perfect state that I want in painting, which is this like ever so slightly haunting, like something that's on the edge of melancholy and nostalgic and haunting. And I think it's because he creates room for this nameless thing. Like, what is this thing we're witnessing? It is not just the picture of these mountains. We're also witnessing him witnessing, or him remembering. And I feel his spirit as I'm looking at these paintings, which, you know, again, as a painter, that is so hard to do. And it just comes so easy for him in a way.
And Maya, that's so fascinating to me that you have that experience, because of course there's a long history of Chinese painting about leaving space for the viewer to enter the space. And the theme of minuscule impact of human beings on a mountainous landscape goes back centuries in China. And yet this is totally a modern approach to it, a modernist approach to it.
Absolutely.
What you were saying, Maya, I wonder if it's because they're so well resolved that you can't help but to see them as compositions, like that it's about the compositioning of compositions or something. I mean, it's just so clear that it's about putting together all the elements, like when he says everything that has to be there is there. Then you can't help but appreciate, or, you know, be looking at composition or color in this very immediate way.
Yeah, I definitely think, and I was talking to my studio manager yesterday, and we were both kind of looking at, there are a lot of big shapes in the paintings, even in the small canvases or small burlap. I think different types of marks make different sounds. There's almost like a auditory quality to his work, which is really like a low resonant sound, like almost like a boing, rather than something that's like ding, 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 ding. And I experience artwork like in this like very auditory way. And I think that's partially why I find his paintings so slow, is because the sound that they bring on is like a gong almost. Like there's and it has a really long echo. These are all things that, as somebody, I've taught painting, and it's interesting, you know, you can teach skills, but you cannot teach that thing. Like, how do you maintain that auditory echo? And I just feel that perhaps because he didn't get that super realistic training, his own sort of way of getting there, he infused, you know, it's like his way to create a realistic image that's his own language allowed him to bring that third thing. A teacher of mine, John Zurier at CCA, used to always say there's the artist, there's the medium, but then there's the third thing, which is the magic. And I think sometimes he really knows how to weave that in.
And Winnie, you were telling me about that you saw a connection with a group of artists that emerged, I think in the 1970s, correct?
Yeah, I was thinking of this problem solving thing I was speaking of earlier. I was thinking of this group in Beijing called the Wuming Group, the group without a name. They came up with it after they were asked to make a name, long retrospectively. But the paintings are stylistically, you know, quite similar, but also in subject matter very similar. And in a way, there's nothing remarkable about Xiao Jiang's painting subject matter. You know, things drawn from daily life in a Chinese city in the 20th century. That's quite recognizable and quite standard. But the situation set up when you are skilled in a certain way, let's say with the technique of painting, and finding that there isn't that much room to explore subject matter. Perhaps similarly, like the Wuming artist, Xiao Jiang has turned to, and quite naturally, to sort of routine everyday life, and just the act of resolving it as a formal problem, and the very activity of what would in a socialist sense be bourgeois or in the contemporary sense, like neoliberal private, endeavor activity can under circumstance be really quite dangerous and radical and actually quite subversive. You aren't, whether in the American sense or the Chinese sense, you're supposed to serve the people with the art, right? I mean, you're supposed to like say something about society and deal something with social problems. To not do it is a statement. I mean, it is a position.
Yes.
To have to take. And in certain moments in time in China, that was a very dangerous position, a rebellious position to take. And I'm not sure that it's a political decision. It's a sort of inevitable private decision if you believe in the spirit of the modern individual, for example, or just an individual's daily life who just happens to be very good at making a painting, so I see, I imagine that Xiao Jiang does not know of this group of artists in the 70s in Beijing who did not rise to prominence and who very rarely seen. But I imagine that there are many similar painters in China in different periods of the 20th century like him, who had to ultimately need to turn to form as a position of independence.
I love what you just said, Winnie. That's the kind of subversive quality of, he's basically saying, without saying, my life and what I see matters as much as like some big political slogan. And I don't know why we're living in a moment where I feel like, well, because of shows like this that Karma has put on, it's giving the viewers the message that your individual life is important. And in a way, he is the only expert of his life. I think often, or at least I'd say until recently, I think this is starting to change. Artists have been expected, and I also see this with like celebrities and entertainers, to almost take on these other roles of politicians and activists, so artists as blank. And I always felt that it was inappropriate to ask so much of an artist or of an actor, or to basically take on all these roles. Xiao Jiang is saying, I am good at painting. I am good at looking very deeply and very closely at my life around me. And it's like, it has this like haiku quality of poetry. I remembered a Buddhist teacher, I'm not Buddhist, but I have friends who are saying that, when you're doing dishes, just try to do the dishes the best that you can. Don't try to keep all these tabs open. And in a way, I feel like he's saying that. He's saying, I'm just going to make this little painting as good as I can, and I'm going to look very closely at my friend in front of me. And God, that is so inspiring. It's very delicate yet powerful.
And yet you could really devote yourself to doing that and not make particularly arresting images too, right?
Yes, he is very good at that, for sure.
Yeah. And this is fascinating. I mean, I'm loving this conversation. And I was wondering if at this moment in China, this does take on a specific meaning around COVID or the latest protests going on, in its simplicity.
Well, now suddenly these white canvases mean something, right?
Right.
But in a way, white canvases or white paper as a protest statement around the world has always meant something, right? We've had through the 20th century, blank canvases are a statement, right? And so if they speak to present moment, it's only because of the present moment's sort of enduring modernist qualities to me.
Yes, but also I felt like this resonated with me with days during the first wave of COVID in New York, where we were all in our apartments, and that became our universe in many ways.
Yeah.
Maya?
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking about what happened to me as a painter, what during COVID, like did it change what I was looking at? And in a way, I mean, I don't know. We don't have him here to answer that question for us. But something tells me that he would have painted these regardless of COVID or not. That's my instinct. But I don't know.
Maya, we heard a lot of that from people like painters or writers who work normally by themselves anyway, that a lot of people said that lockdown was no different from me. It's nice to see everyone else learning how to do this, and
Yeah.
whether it's
but interestingly, it may gain him a wider audience because more people have gone through the experience of living with one other person or living alone during a dark time. So I don't think it's coincidental that these kind of images are finding resonance with New Yorkers right now, because I think it was the context that so many people were in going through COVID.
You know, I wonder, when I look at art that I like, I tend to be drawn to work that's made by artists who are like 40 plus. I don't know what that says about me, but there's a kind of wisdom that I guess it has. You sort of have to have lived a couple of decades to, and this is no judgment against younger artists, but it's more just like the work that really captures my full spirit tends to be by artists that are a little bit older. And, you know, I'd be curious to see who's most excited about this work and who's most excited about seeing these paintings, because I feel like Xiao Jiang, he doesn't seem concerned about Instagram and TikTok. Like his work is just like living in a parallel universe. Like he's still making, like, I feel like he made these paintings for me and people like me who like to look at this kind of stuff. But I want, you know what I'm saying? I wonder, like, I'm not really concerned about the audience when I make my own work. And I really feel that perhaps he's in a similar place. And I wonder if perhaps artists who provide this kind of, let's just call it slow art, you know, art that's wants you to be there in person looking at it, is like, it's the beginning of like a new movement. You know, there's like the slow food movement. There's like, so I wonder if this, like, there's so much fast viewing online and on social media that, and people even do these like technology detox retreats where they pay thousands of dollars to be away from everything that's fast. So I wonder if he's just providing this sort of like alternative, or maybe something that our sick bodies are going to be craving in the next 10, 20 years. I mean, I don't know.
It's the fast, slow thing, but it's also the unspecificity of the images that you mentioned. The sort of the no need to announce an identity. And so many of these paintings could be, you could imagine the painter living in many different places and at different times. And it's not that it's universal. It's that there's no requirement to mark who it is, where it is, when it is, in that really specific way that we almost now cannot speak without saying, I'm an Asian American woman living, you know, etc. before we can speak. And he's not requiring himself to do that, even though these are specific places and specific subjects, and we can recognize them.
Well, I think that kind of permission is really inspiring. And I hope, you know, younger artists that are going to see this work, they can see this as an option, right? Like, and I even think about when I'm making my own work, sometimes I'm so aware of appropriation or borrowing and just kind of feeling the sort of the eye that's on me all the time, making sure that I stick within my background is, you know, I'm from Bosnia, and I want to make sure that I'm using my specific history. And I sometimes feel like it's difficult to stay completely authentic if you feel like you can only take from your own personal history. And I just find his work so refreshing in that it's as if he's kind of zoomed out and gone beyond all those little questions that seem so important. And maybe that sense of zooming out is in the lack of specificity, and everything seems like there's a line that's almost blurred between dream logic and actuality.
So I myself prefer the interior scenes, the architectural ones, to the landscape ones. But I know, Barbara, the landscape ones are the ones you've been talking about the most.
Well, I just see a continuity between almost ancient Chinese stories and reasoning and the mountain scenes. But I also am very struck by the interiors. That's why I brought up COVID and the notion of a lone figure in a studio, which obviously that's an experience shared by many artists, but now it's shared by many, many, many people because of the experience of the pandemic. But also what both of you were saying about not necessarily specifying identity, I find that's an issue that I find very, very interesting, because right now, many, many Chinese artists and Asian American artists are rebelling against the notion that they have to use stereotypes or iconography to express their culture and or their identity, and or even have the responsibility of expressing their culture. So I see him fitting in with that, though he's very unique in many other ways.
There's so much proper red in his paintings, but they're not like Chinese red.
Right. Can
you say more about that, Winnie? I'm curious. Proper red, but not Chinese red. Is it the kind of like the cool tone of his, or?
I think just that red is, the national color. It's the festive color. It's the color that is most enjoyed and that is most shared in Chinese culture. And these paintings are red and green, and the red is prominent, but they are not used in that identitarian way, I guess, that says Chinese painting.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not like a bright, significant element in the work. It's in the shadows of the other colors in the painting.
Yeah, and I remember when we were first talking, the three of us, I was kind of saying how even his reds feel cool, like his palette is very cold. And I think that's what kind of evokes this nostalgic melancholy feel that we've been talking about. And I think it's just so interesting how I think that's part of the artist's, every artist has their way of handling color. And I just feel like he somehow, his language is to cool everything down in a certain way. And I was also thinking, as somebody whose color is so important to my work, there's a way in which I find that drawing and the shapes are almost the more important containers of color. And I was doing this the other day. I do this a lot with artists that I like. I look at everything in black and white on like in a grayscale, just to see if it still holds up. So for example, if you look at a Rothko in a grayscale, and then if you look at somebody like, I don't know, like Amy Sillman in a grayscale, you'll get a very different kind of emotional resonance. And his paintings really hold up in a grayscale, which tells me that he's a really amazing draftsman, like in terms of drawing and kind of creating composition and shape. So the colors, it's almost like, they're just like his signature colors that he can sort of interplay and move from interior and exterior. There's almost this like porousness. And I think that's why, in my opinion, the interiors and exteriors, they almost feel psychological rather than actual exterior landscapes and interior. They all somehow seem to be about a psychological state that I feel like he sees the world through. but I'm sure I'm projecting.
No, what you're saying there, and what Barbara was saying earlier about the Chinese tradition of the painter imagining himself in the landscape as the sort of quintessential artistic kind of mode is like the quintessential Western mode of the artist in the studio, right? In the sense that like imagining yourself in the studio, in the Chinese tradition, it's almost like imagining yourself in the mountain is the studio, right? And so the two kind of work, what you're saying about it being the same psychological state, it does kind of work here, especially it works in the progression of his works as well. And maybe, Barbara, that has to do with COVID too. I mean, or the experience of lockdown, and that the difference between work and play, or work and non-work life, work and life balance, that's what artists can teach us to, right? To not think of as oppositions or as separations.
The other thing I was thinking when you were talking, Winnie, is that for a long time, artists from Asia were described as a bridge between the East and the West. And it's interesting when you think of Xiao's work about that, because it doesn't feel like it's from either hemisphere, or that there's a conflict between the hemispheres in his work. And I think that comes from him doing very personal work. Even though he's not a person who uses his identity in public, this is very revealing a very personal situation.
Well, I think it's because he's like, it's like private in the sense that it's personal, and there's like the private that's performative. Like, I don't find his work performative. And I just feel like performance is something that I find plagues the American painterly landscape, the contemporary moment. It's almost as if artists are expected to perform, and then that's visible in the actual objects that they make. And I don't feel that way with Xiao's work. And I think that's why it feels so completely sincere.
Yes, it does feel sincere.
There's a sincerity there. That was maybe when I was in school, we were taught that that's a little naive, or a little, all these, I remember I have a list of words that were like bad words, like personal, naive, and, and he's just like, here I am. All of that, he's just put a big okay on it.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, I should have interrupted. Winnie, do you have something to add to what Maya's talking about?
Only that when the three of us spoke with him, I think we were disarmed by that.
Yeah.
And then almost as if we couldn't think of a way to understand that non-performativity, except by saying, oh, it must be a kind of non-egotistical presentation. But it's not. I think it's just sincere.
Yeah.
And I'll say that having interviewed and met many artists with a similar training and in China, I would say that he seemed to me very much like those artists as well. Many artists speak in this way, with this kind of training, with this conundrum I was talking about what to paint, if I'm a painter, and so I don't think that that's an extremely sort of unique kind of a singular situation either. And I do think it comes from the social situation of having the skill and being able to do this with it. It's just, in this case, for me, it's the resolution of the quality of resolution of this work is to me remarkable. But this kind of, from what I know from speaking with him, the social existence is not unique at all.
Yeah.
Well, we have about 15 minutes left, and I want to urge people to send in questions if you have it. We have time to take a few questions. One question that a person already submitted in is that they saw a Nordic quality. And I think it's the same as you saying it's painted in a cool palette. I mean, I think it's pretty unlikely that he saw Nordic painting during his training, but it's an interesting connection. Go ahead.
We were surprised when we asked him what influences he had. They were not paintings that looked like this, right? They were really quite realist, or right?
Yeah, he mentioned like Velasquez and
Right,
yeah,
and I was like, oh,
right.
Yeah,
they were
even the
not,
lighting is completely different in those.
right? Yes, they weren't
Yeah.
stylistically or formally or compositionally this kind of work. So that was extremely interesting.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
I was going to say, the first artist I thought of, maybe because it's the burlap and the kind of not enough paint quality, I was thinking of Munch. And then right after that, I was thinking about Giorgio Morandi, which are totally different, but somehow I felt that kind of stillness that I love about Morandi's work. And then I was even thinking about some of those Dievenkorns, but yeah, he didn't mention those artists at all. So
yeah, he didn't mention any of those artists. And you know, and I think it would have been interesting if we talked to him longer about how he saw works of Velasquez. I think it was probably online or in a catalog rather than in person. So, I mean, for a Western person looking at these paintings, I'm very struck by that the surface is not built up,
right,
but very flat. And the way he would have seen those old masters that he mentioned would have been on a screen. So again, a flatness to it.
About the Nordic quality, I wonder if it has to do with the mountains, because I've never seen mountains. I mean, not never, but it's rare to see mountains treated like this by a Chinese painter in such a geometric fashion. And for me, that was it is an indication of the sort of industrial kind of colonization of nature, you know, in the 20th century, and this the sort of the very man-made feeling from it. But it need not be. It may just be different kinds of mountains. But mountains aren't normally painted at all like this in Chinese paintings.
Yeah.
So I wonder if that's the Nordic, the sort of peaks one doesn't normally see. So
another question that came up, and I think we asked him this during our conversation, was how long does it take him to make one of the big paintings? Did we ask him that?
We did.
Yeah.
And he didn't give a specific answer. He said essentially depends on the painting. And I did say, is it like one a day? And he laughed like that was just so absurd. But he didn't give any time for any typical painting. But he said, I am not fast.
Yeah, and he did say that he does one painting at a time. He's not working on multiple paintings at the same time, which is interesting.
You know, that seems to make sense to me. I find that when I was painting more in the figurative representational style, I could not paint more than one at a time. And I find that to be, you know, interesting. Now I can do more than one, but when he said that, it seemed to make sense, especially with the kind of emotional quality they have. It's almost like he's not just covering surfaces. And he said something, Winnie, that you kind of reminded us, where he said everything that's in there needs to be there. So there's like such a focus on every specific little element is considered.
Well, do either of you have last things you want to insert in the conversation that we haven't covered yet before we close? Winnie?
I was curious about what you both thought of the many the white, the sort of white canvases, the frames, the sort of picture within picture kind of device that appears in a lot of the paintings, or the decision to leave like blank canvases, like literally rectangles in so many spots, or in each of the paintings, I feel.
I was almost thinking like, it's almost like a little wink to himself and to other painters, like the blank one is the beginning of the next painting. How, I don't know, I'm sure I'm projecting a lot, but as a painter, I know that whenever I'm close to finishing the painting, it's almost like you can't wait to be done so you can start the next one. And it's almost like he's kind of like stringing them all along in some way, kind of already giving us a hint of what's to come.
Oh, that's interesting.
I
I
know.
also think one of them is a self-portrait in the painting, the large painting with his wife in the studio, and the painting stacks divide the room in half. I think there's a small self-portrait there. So I kind of think of all the white canvases as himself, and like the modesty of his presentation of himself, which I just feel that from these paintings.
I wonder if through that, in a way, it's also like a mirror. If they are himself, it's like a mirror looking back at him. And it's also like the history of painting, looking at him while he's painting.
Oh, interesting. Interesting.
What do you think, Winnie?
I don't know. I honestly, I find those very arresting, and the painting that looks like a landscape with road signs, with all the road signs kind of blanked out in a way or turned into just white and gray rectangles, really, really just enigmatic. And the color in that painting just, like a puzzle. So yeah, that's those white parts I think are to me where I feel like there's like a deeper mystery or an invitation to interpretation, or maybe, as Maya was saying, to the next painting or something. But they repeat often enough that it's interesting. The other thing I find repeats that I didn't see until Karma just showed us the gallery walkthrough were the clouds. It's the only element that's so clearly stylized, right? Like in a conventional, almost historical form, like to paint clouds that way. I didn't notice that before, but now they really stand out.
They are striking. I noticed that too. And even, I think I mentioned this in a different conversation we had, where the clouds are so round and organic, and they almost have like you said, stylized quality. And they even feel more organic than the bodies he paints. The bodies to me read like mountains too, that are just kind of formal differences between it, like a leg being a leg and not a part of a mountain, whereas the clouds are clouds. There's no chameleoning of the cloud being anything else, which is really interesting.
So the last question that's come up, many people have asked this question, and I think we covered it, but maybe it needs to be repeated. A lot of people have said, well, the white paintings are clearly a reference to the white paper, to the protests. And, in point of fact, these paintings were painted well before the protests, since they broke out while the show was over. But I also think when you mentioned something like the white signs by the highway, that he is avoiding a kind of specificity. And what those signs would be normally are brands. And his work is in a universe quite separate from both politics and commercialism.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Barbara. I noticed that too. Like, he's not interested in that at all.
I mean, but on the other hand, that interpretation is, I think, quite possible and fair, because blank paper, blank canvases used in protests is saying the same thing, right? That saying nothing is what we can say, right? And saying nothing is worth saying. And saying nothing is all we can say and all that we share. That is a similar message. Usage of blank paper in protest is not unlike the use of blank rectangles in his paintings, even if they don't say the same thing, right? It's the same form. It's the same micro-political gesture anyway.
Well, thank you. That's a perfect image to close with. Thank you, Winnie, and thank you, Maya, and thank you, Karma, and everybody who's attended. Hope to meet you all in the gallery soon. Thank you.